that, Kelly, I will disappear and hand it over to you.
Emily, thank you so much. Very glad to be back with you all today, talking about psychological safety. As we go through together, we'll explore psychological safety and specifically how that social and emotional safety impacts learning experiences and corporate learning culture. Before we start on content, I actually want to ask a favor from all of you. So if you're joining in, my favor is actually going to be a moment of reflection. And I want to ask for you to reflect on these 5 scenarios I'll put on the screen in just a moment. And I want you to think about if you have ever experienced or seen someone else experience any of these scenarios, whether in a physical room or a virtual room. And then I'll ask Emily to pull the group for us together. But take a moment to review these 5 scenarios. I'd like you to think to yourself, have you ever experienced or seen someone else experience one of these moments? And Emily, when you have a moment, we'll go ahead and put up that first poll to say, yes, I have seen or experienced, or no, I have not seen or experienced any of these scenarios. Highlighting from the chat a question about L&D because it can mean learning disabilities. It can also mean labor and delivery, but in this context, it's going to mean learning and development for the entire session. I'll give you all just an extra moment to commit to, have you seen or experienced any of the scenarios I showed or not? And then I'll ask Emily to show the results to everybody. I'll pull this bigger so that I can see your response rates. So of the folks that have responded, it looks like we have, percentage-wise, very few people who have never seen or experienced something like this. The majority of us have seen or experienced something like these scenarios. And so I'm going to ask one more question, but this next question is going to be rhetorical. Emily, do we want to share the results with us? Thank you, thank you. An overwhelming yes. As we go back to the slides, I'm going to ask you, as you think about these scenarios and those experiences, since the majority of us have seen or experienced something like this, that rhetorical question is, what changes after that experience? What happens after that moment? As you think about what changes after the experience, there's probably a lot of potential answers that you might have, but I would say there is one fairly consistent response, and that is what changes after those moments is how you feel. That shift in how you feel is going to likely inform or impact how you and others around you act moving forward, whether that's conscious or not. And as you think about that change in future behavior, the shift that you felt in that moment, that's a shift in the climate of psychological safety in the group that you're in. As we think about psychological safety, this is a climate that we need to be mindful of because a positive climate of psychological safety is necessary for success as we think about the knowledge economy. In our current economy, the desire for organizational innovation, scaled growth, efficient and effective communication informs our need for collaboration. Our organizations work more collaboratively than they ever have before. Almost every role is going to interact with another person, and the ability to effectively and efficiently communicate has become more and more necessary. So as we think about the climate of psychological safety and how that shifts over time, we need to be aware of that climate and be thoughtful on how we impact the local organizational climate of psychological safety. I'm going to pause for just a moment as you process, and then we'll move forward. I have another poll question. I'll ask Emily to put this up as soon as she's ready. But that next poll question is asking you about your interactions with learning. So as you think about your relationship with learning in your current organization, which of those answers most closely identifies your relationship with learning in your organization? I'll give y'all a moment to answer. So you might say that you are strictly a learner, that that's the main role that you have. You may say that you design or facilitate learning or learning experiences. You might be a trainer. You may be a leader of learning strategy or a director of learning. You might be in leadership and directly influence the learning culture. And if none of those fit for you, you can also choose other. Looks like only about half of us have responded, so I'll give you one more moment to identify which one most closely aligns with your role with learning in your organization today. Last few seconds, and Emily, I'll go ahead and ask you to close out and share the results. So it looks like we have a fairly broad spread of who is with us in the room together today. As we think about this session, the kinds of things that I talk about, I will try to span folks who are coming in just as a learner or an employee into folks who design and facilitate learning, as well as folks who are more in the strategy and influence of learning culture. I have one more poll question as we think about who's in the room and what we're doing as a group together today. And that next poll question is, how are you? And before we open up the poll, I want to let you know that that's how are you on a scale of sheep today. So if you will go ahead and identify which sheep most closely aligns how you are feeling in this exact moment, and then you'll go ahead and choose your number. I want to get a sense for how we're all doing together today. I'll note that I am a sheep 5. I have 2 kids. They are 2 and 4, which means I am pretty permanently tired. They're lovely, but exhausting. And as I think about my sheep scale, I'm frequently on a sheep 5. For those of you that might be a sheep 6, I aspire to sheep 6-edness in my day-to-day life. But we'll take a quick look at some of the poll results. It looks like we're a little under half. I will not ask you why you are the sheep that you are. You can keep that to yourself as you're thinking through which one best represents how you're feeling today. And we can go ahead and close out and share as we think about how we're doing together in this conversation. I like to get an understanding of how folks are doing and what you're bringing to the conversation, and also give you a moment to reflect on how you're feeling and experiencing our conversation together today, so that we're all mindful of what we're bringing together to the room. It looks like we had a handful of sheep 3s, and I always wonder if sheep 3 is a good hair day or a bad hair day. But I mentioned I would not ask you why you are the sheep that you are, so I'll maintain that as we move forward. I have asked who you are and how you are. I'll go ahead and share a little bit about myself. So again, my name is Kelli Frey. I have successfully facilitated learning for many years in countries and cultures around the world, ages 8 to over 80. I have a degree in HR, a CPTD, a handful of certifications, but I'm very excited to meet you all, and I would love to know you better. Feel free to say hi on LinkedIn, and we can continue the conversation. But I wanted to touch just briefly on who I am, and then we can move forward into our content. I want to put a quick roadmap of where we're going in our content together today. So I'll start with what we know about psychological safety. So it'll be a brief history, some definitions, really just some space to make sure we're using shared language and have a shared understanding before we get into what I think we're really all here for, which is how does psychological safety translate into learning? And what does that look like between what we know today and what we can assume and infer for learning? And then I really like personally for everyone who leaves my sessions to leave doing something differently because you joined this conversation today. So as we get into how do you measure psychological safety and how do you increase psychological safety or encourage a climate of psychological safety, my hope is as we get through the session that you can identify one or more things that you will do differently because you joined us together today. So I'll start at the very beginning of this roadmap, which is what we know about psychological safety. Before we get into the content itself, I want to note that there's a lot of nuance to this topic. We're not going to have time to explore all of that nuance, and I want you to keep that in mind as we jump in. But we'll start here with some history and some theory to make sure we're all on the same page. For history, there's a lot of history. I'm just going to highlight 3 plot points on that history. So we'll start with Google's Project Aristotle. If you haven't heard of this, Charles Duhigg did a Harvard Business Review article that talked about it. I encourage you to look it up, or it's in my references at the end. But the article talked about the project, which is Google's question is what makes great teams great? So that they could, in theory, make other teams great. And the large-scale answer to that was psychological safety. If you've read anything about psychological safety, you've likely heard Amy Edmondson's name. She's the foremost researcher in this space, and I reference her work quite a bit. But she authored The Fearless Organization, which is a book I highly recommend as you're beginning or exploring psychological safety. And then I also really like, from that work, Timothy Clark's 4 Stages of Psychological Safety, and we'll spend some time looking at that framework together. What's important to know about these history points and the research and insights we have about psychological safety is that all of these have historically focused only on team dynamics and traditional teams. And as we think about how that applies to learning, learning and teams are not a one-to-one relationship. And so we'll talk about those differences in our next section, but I wanted to keep that in mind. I'll take a moment to highlight a definition for us to all use the same language and spend some time digging into that. But I'll start with the earliest definition we have that I've been able to reference is from 1999. Again, this is Amy Edmondson. She has a more recent definition, and so that is what you see on the screen, which is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. We're going to come back to the Timothy Clark bit in just a moment, but as we look at this definition, I want to highlight a couple of spaces and broaden how we talk about them. So I want to start with the word shared in this definition. For psychological safety, it must be shared across team members. This is not something that happens between 2 people, but it happens as a group. It is a belief, and what's important about beliefs is you cannot force someone to believe what you want them to believe. If we could, that would make all of this much easier. But folks are going to believe what they think is true, whether you agree with that or not. And so that's an important part of the definition. I also want to note safety. And I think safety is important to call out that it is not a binary moment. You are not either safe or unsafe, but typically you feel some level of safety between those on a spectrum. So you might feel a little safe, a lot safe, and that's going to depend on a number of factors, including the people, the circumstances, the time of day, maybe the physical location. There's a lot that happens as you think about safety. And then I think the most important piece of this definition is actually interpersonal risk. And I think interpersonal risk is something I wasn't able to clearly define when I first started reading about psychological safety. So I want to spend just a moment thinking about this. And I would describe interpersonal risk as the vulnerability to humiliation or the risk of rejection or criticism, the risk of damage to your personal brand. If I say the wrong thing, will somebody think differently or poorly of me? If I make a mistake, how will that impact the way I interact with others in the future? So as we think about psychological safety, it is an interpersonal climate consisting of shared beliefs for group norms. And I think that's important as we think about how we move forward with this definition and with psychological safety generally. I want to spend just a moment thinking about what it's not. So we've talked about what it is and the history. Just briefly, there are a couple of misconceptions I've heard commonly. One of those seems obvious, but I want to call it out. This is not physical safety. If somebody is concerned for their physical well-being, that is unrelated to the interpersonal risk that we're talking about for like humiliation or risk of rejection or impact to personal brand. Physical safety is very different. I also want to call out belonging. Oftentimes folks feel that belonging and psychological safety are the same. And although they do have some overlap for how you might think about them, you might feel a sense of belonging and a sense of psychological safety in similar places. They are not a result of one another. And so I think it's important to note there's some difference there. And then I finally want to call out the word trust. Trust focuses on the belief that one person has about another person, where psychological safety is more about how group members believe they are viewed or how they believe they'll be treated, as opposed to that one-to-one relationship for trust. So I wanted to call out just a few things that were a little bit different than how you might think about psychological safety. There was a note in the comment about the Timothy Clark bit. We're going to come back to that framework. So again, this was built off of Google's Project Aristotle and Amy Edmondson's research. And there are 4 stages. Those 4 stages build off of one another. So I'll start with the first stage. And this stage is called inclusion safety. But I want to note that it is a move from exclusion to inclusion. That the question you might ask is, am I safe to be in this room or virtual room or in this group of people? If you have that first stage of psychological safety, you can then move into the second stage, which is called learner safety. And as somebody from learning and development or from L&D, this made me really happy. But I think it's important to note here that there is a vulnerability to learning, and that's what's being referenced in this stage 2, that you need to be open to imperfection. You need to be willing to admit you don't know everything. And that potential open to vulnerability is that second stage. So is it safe for me to belong in this room? Is it safe for me to be vulnerable in this group of people? Before we get to the third stage, and that third stage is contributor safety. And this is it safe to speak up, to answer a question, to share a comment or a response? And I think this one we see a lot in learning experiences, live learning experiences, as something that we want. The last of these 4 stages is challenger safety. And this is the one that I think most people think about when they think psychological safety. Is it safe to go against the grain or ask tough questions or tell someone you don't agree? So as you think about the 4 stages from Timothy Clark's psychological safety, I think there is a good level of how you grow in psychological safety or the different levels you might see or experience. We will answer questions again at the end, but I want to note one question, which is, what is the difference between inclusion safety and belonging? Inclusion safety is, can I be in the room? Is it okay to be here? And it's more of a yes, no, where a sense of belonging tends to go past that and to be more inclusive as you think about, do I have a sense of belonging in this group of people? And so I think of them as slightly different, but there is some overlap there. So I wanted to keep my theory and history brief because I think it's really exciting, but I think what you're here for is how do we think about psychological safety in its translation to learning. A lot of times, as we think specifically about live learning experiences, you might, as a learning facilitator, stand at the front of a room or a virtual room with, 60 people that you've never met before and invite them into a space where you need to have some psychological safety, but you don't necessarily have deep relationships with those folks. And so as we think about how psychological safety is built very quickly, very effectively, very efficiently in a space where you don't have all of the information that you might on a team setting where the research is historically from, there's also, I think, in learning a difference in the power dynamics at play. And so there's a lot of implied power or indirect power to be mindful of as we think about learning. So when we look at the translation for psychological safety, I want to start with the definition itself. So as we think about translating it for learning, the way I like to describe it, and this is a personal preference, is that it is safe to be seen trying. So the same four things that we highlighted in the earlier definition, that it is a shared belief that it is safe to take interpersonal risk, all of those things are still existing in this definition that we're looking at here. But I think the specific act of trying is important for learning as we think about moving from a place where I don't know something to where I do know something or I've learned something. But getting into that I have learned, I can replicate that behavior, that learning requires a little bit of try, if you will. As we think about corporate learning, I wanted to separate my recommendations in the way we talk about psychological safety into two spaces. So a micro space, which I will define here as sort of learning experiences, and then the macro space of learning culture. And so as we think about those two different sides of, or two different scales of corporate learning, I'll talk about psychological safety in my recommendations, both for sort of learning experiences, which I think will be most applicable to folks who design, deliver, or train, where learning culture might be more applicable to folks closer to the strategy or influencing their learning culture. But we'll talk about both as we move forward. I want to spend some time talking about failure and failure of learning. There is a tie of a risk of failure and learning that is inextricable. It has to be tied together. As you think about learning something new, if somebody shows you how to do something new, most of us are not going to be able to immediately replicate that in a perfect one-to-one way. So as you think about learning something, there is an inherent risk of failure as a requirement for going through the learning process. And I think that's really important to note. As most people, and I can ask this for a rhetorical question, but how many of us want to fail in front of our peers, our coworkers, our manager? And my guess would be none of us. But as we think about the risk of failure, there's actually an answer to the question I'm going to ask you. And I'll put that up or ask Emily to put that up in a poll in just a minute. But what is the optimal failure rate for learning? There is one, and the study is again referenced at the end of my slides, but what is the optimal rate for learning for failure? So Emily, if you want to put up the poll for that optimal failure rate, I'd love to get a sense for what we think failure, the optimal rate of failure is for a learning experience. I appreciate the note in the chat. I really don't want to fail in front of my coworkers. Same, David. I also would like to not fail in front of my coworkers generally. Looks like we have a handful of answers and an answer in every category. Give you just one more moment to commit before we share those answers with everybody. Let's go ahead and turn those over to the group as we think about what is the optimal failure rate for learning. It looks like we maybe don't have a ton of consensus here, but the answer from the study is that there is a 15% optimal failure rate. So in a optimal space for learning, you want to be failing 15% of the time. Oh no, I failed. Thank you, James. I think we as humans generally don't want to fail. That risk, as we think about interpersonal risk and psychological safety for being humiliated or rejected or criticized, really plays into how we think about learning. And so I think there's a really strong tie between psychological safety and the vulnerability necessary to learn. So I think it's important as we think about learning to be mindful of psychological safety because it's really necessary for how we exist in the world. I appreciate the psychological warfare going on with the weird numbers versus traditional numbers in my answers for that, the optimal rate of failure in learning. I want to pause briefly on learning culture. There's a lot of research that talks about learning culture and how having a culture that is focused on learning allows folks to have better development of their leaders, improved retention. Having growth mindsets relates to high performance. It also impacts ultimately the individuals with increased productivity and job satisfaction. There's a whole host of research that talks about that. But what I think is important to note as we think about learning culture and its relationship to psychological safety is that what we just talked about in sort of that micro scale for failure and learning in psychological safety also needs to be true in a large scale for learning culture, that you need your leaders, your peers, your colleagues to be willing to seek, share, and apply new knowledge. And in order to do that, you have to take that risk, that interpersonal risk, in order to get to that. And so a culture of psychological safety is sort of necessary for a learning culture. So as we think about, is it safe to be seen trying in our learning experiences and our learning culture, that psychological safety is really a core to both of those scales of growth. So we've talked a little bit about what psychological safety is, its history, what we know about it. We've talked about how that exists in learning. Let's talk a little bit about how we measure psychological safety. How do we know that it's there or not? I have found that most frequently when I measure psychological safety, it is easier to measure when it is not there as opposed to when it is there. So I'd love for y'all to chat in. When there's a lack of psychological safety, what do you see? And for those of you that do live learning experiences, you can talk about this in learning. But for those of you that maybe don't, you're welcome to talk about this in a group or team setting as well. When there is not psychological safety, what do you see? Ashley, thank you for being my first answer here. Silence, quiet, people not sharing, absolutely. Finger pointing and blame, absolutely. People hold back, subgroups happening, closed body language and fear, lack of collaboration or energy, absolutely, my friends. Rumors, low morale, high turnover, I'm assuming that means high turnover or just turnover. Lack of innovation, absolutely. Employment tribunal sounds really serious. Groupthink, thank you so much. I think all of those are absolutely something that you will see when you think about a space where there is not psychological safety. I want to pause on some of our early answers here because this is actually a really popular answer, unfortunately, which is when we don't see psychological safety, we do see silence. And I think it's important to call out this response because, first of all, it is predictable. We know that this is going to happen, right? I think most people's first answer was it's quiet, it's people not speaking up, it's silent. But it's also important to note that this is one of the opportunities that you don't have. You don't see it. So if somebody has closed body language or groupthink, you might be able to see and respond to that. But if somebody chooses not to answer a question or if they choose not to speak up, you're not necessarily going to see that moment happen. And that's because there's an internal microanalysis happening for each of your participants about the power dynamics in the room. Is it okay to speak up first? Is it okay to speak up at all? Is it okay to choose these words or different words? And all of those internal microanalyses are happening at any given time when you ask for input or engagement. Frequently, that's unexamined. Not often do people actively think, Kelli's not going to choose to speak up because David is in the room. I don't know who David is. But as we think about that analysis that's happening, that microanalysis and the predictable response of silence, folks are not often going to speak up in that space. I want to note that this is referenced in a Harvard Business Review article that talks about the value of speaking up, that there is an inherent value to the employer or the company for their employees to speak up, but is frequently not as true for the individual. I do want to reference that a lot of this research is done in a North American environment. And so as we think about some of the different cultures, this could be slightly different, but I have found that this has been fairly true for folks in other cultures as well, that when we see silence or folks not speaking up, that it tends to indicate a potential lack of psychological safety. As we think about not just silence, but our learning experiences, staying in that micro space for, I want to come back to Timothy Clark's 4 stages of psychological safety. So when you're in a learning experience, if you see that people feel connected or comfortable in the physical room or virtual room, you can feel fairly confident that you have that first stage. And this is when you are examining potentially their body language or the way they interact with others around them. As we think about learner safety, this is, are they willing or open to learn? I often see a lack of this second stage as defensiveness, defiance, or dismissal of the content or engagement moment that's happening. That third stage, contributor safety, that ties directly to the silence that we just talked about. But if you see that people are answering your questions, are connecting to a conversation or having effective communication, you can make some assumptions about that third stage. And I think challenger safety is probably the most obvious when you have people that are willing to go against the grain or challenge the conversation. I want to talk about learning culture measurement at a large scale. So Amy Edmondson has a survey with some statements that she shares. And so I'll put those on the screen for a moment. This is referenced in that book, The Fearless Organization. The top 5 statements, disagreement would indicate psychological safety. And then the bottom 4 statements, agreement would indicate psychological safety. So just a note as you're looking at these statements that they're not all the same as we look at the measurement. But this is a way you might be able to get a sense culturally for how folks are feeling in psychological safety. As we think about learning culture and that measurement, I think this is true for a lot of organizational culture conversations, which is organizational culture is the sum of individual actions at your organization that one person can make a difference, both positive and negative. And unfortunately, the real answer here is there's not a formula to achieve a culture of psychological safety. There are a lot of individual actions that you can do or use, but there's not a formula that I'm going to give you and say, this is the answer. For better or for worse. But I do want to answer, what do you do to increase a climate of psychological safety? You want folks to feel more psychologically safe. What are the things that you can do, the actions that you can take? So I'll make some recommendations for this conversation today. Before we get into those recommendations, I want to note a couple of things. One, this is not a one-size-fits-all, so I would like you to be thoughtful about the culture and climate that you exist in for how you might apply these recommendations. And that it is a practice in that you don't do it once, check the box, and never come back to that again. That typically you're going to need your psychologically safe practices to happen over and over again. And I also encourage most people, where possible, to encourage the buy-in and behavior change at the leadership level. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. So let's talk about those areas of action. We talked about sort of a micro learning experience option and a macro learning culture option. So I'll give some recommendations in both spaces. As a learning experience designer or deliverer, I would recommend that you reduce unnecessary risk. Now, earlier I told you you have to have risk as a part of a learning experience, and that is true. We don't want to use unnecessary risk that is not helpful for what we are ultimately trying to do in our learning experiences. And then on the learning culture side, and this is going to tend to be more towards leadership or learning strategy, we want to destigmatize failure culturally. So we want our folks to move away from the stigma of failure as we think about how do we encourage a climate of psychological safety. And I'll dive into these to expand on what are the kinds of things you can actually do to influence this. And we'll start with reducing unnecessary risk. So my first recommendation here is to increase processing time. I really like this recommendation because it also tends to be neurodiverse friendly. There are lots of ways that you can increase processing time. A fairly common one for a learning experience is if you're going to ask for something, you can ask for it in advance to give folks time to process. An example of that might be if I'm going to have a learning experience focused on good feedback. In the learning experience, if I ask, hey, Kelly, what is an example of really great feedback you've received? If you ask that in the moment, I might have a hard time coming up with a great answer. But if you ask me in an email ahead of time and give me some time to process that question, I can come to the conversation more prepared, and it reduces the unnecessary risk of me not coming up with an answer at all in that live conversation. You can also do this if you do things like pair and share or group conversations as part of your learning experiences, where instead of saying, okay, go ahead and talk about it and asking people to process live out loud together, you can give them maybe 30 seconds or a minute to think about their answer first, and then invite them to a group conversation or paired conversation. And that 30 seconds to a minute can really impact how people engage in the content. So if you have folks who prefer processing, you're giving them the opportunity to be successful. You're reducing the unnecessary risk of failure, humiliation, criticism by giving them some of that time to process. One of my favorite examples is actually a very small example, and I've seen it a lot post-pandemic as we've worked in a more virtual environment. And that is the experience on Zoom. Maybe this has not happened to any of you, but it has absolutely happened to me, where somebody says, "Hey, Kelly, what are your thoughts?" And I don't know. I may have been paying attention to the conversation, but that being on the spot in that moment of panic is not terribly comfortable. So as we think about how do you increase the processing time, if you were to say, "Hey, Kelly, based on your role in this organization, what do you think about Tim's recommendation here?" That change in sentence structure in the request is an increase in processing time because you've alerted me that this is something you're asking me to do, and then you've given me the question. And so it changes that processing time just a little bit, and it reduces some of that unnecessary risk of being nervous or feeling like you might be criticized for your answer. The second recommendation I'll talk about for how do you reduce unnecessary risk, and that is to recognize power dynamics. Now, this is hard to do because you don't always know all of the power dynamics at play, but sometimes you can make strong assumptions. And so that might be where you're in a room. Do you know if you have only peers, or do you have peers and managers and leaders? So as you think about the potential for power dynamics, when you ask a question like, "Tell me about something that's not going well in your work today," I might not want to answer that question in front of my boss. So thinking about the power dynamics in the room as you experience that, and how folks might react or respond differently based on that kind of space. I'll note here that my favorite response or answer is to increase the anonymity of what you're asking. So if you are asking folks to identify what sheep they are, instead of asking each person to put their name next to it in the chat or their name next to it out loud, using a poll is going to increase the anonymity and decrease the concern about the power dynamics at play, because I'm no longer associating my answer with Kelly, but my answer with someone in the room. And that anonymity can help folks feel more comfortable. It reduces the risk of feeling like they might be called out, criticized, that interpersonal risk that we talk about for psychological safety. My last recommendation here for how do we reduce unnecessary risk is to make group norms explicit. So you want to not leave it up to assumption, but to express when people are doing the behaviors you want them to do, and you can preface what you want folks to do. So a lot of times in a learning experience, you might have ground rules for, "I want you to come into this conversation being brave," or "I want you to come into this conversation with ears open." So be explicit about the group norms that you're asking for. You can also encourage the behavior you want to see. So if somebody asks a question, you can say, "Thanks for that question, it was really valuable," and then move forward with the question itself. So making those expectations explicit can help folks feel more comfortable and confident by reducing the unnecessary risk or ambiguity in the learning experience itself. We'll spend a little bit of time in the learning culture, so more of a strategic space, leadership space, as I think about how do you destigmatize failure. And this is a big ask and likely not something you're going to do with one moment or one recommendation. But my favorite answer here is, how do you model vulnerability? How do you prove to folks that it is safe to take that interpersonal risk? Oftentimes, this is your leaders making the same behavior that you're asking of your folks below them, by proving that it is safe to take that risk, to share that experience. When I ask leaders to model vulnerability, they typically say, "Great, Kelly, how do I do that?" And that takes me to my second space, which is to frame a failure or mistake with learning. So instead of saying, "This is the thing that went wrong and here's the impact of it," although that's an important statement, I encourage folks to say, "This is what happened and here's what we're going to do differently," or "Here's what I learned because we did that." And focusing on the learning aspect of that failure mistake issue is going to destigmatize the failure itself and focus on what you're doing differently and how you're moving forward. My third space to talk about here is acknowledging difficulty before it happens. So when we think about something that might be risky or difficult, if I say, I know there are obstacles here, or I know it's going to be difficult at this point in the process, we are destigmatizing potential failure by recognizing that it's difficult or not easy. We want people to communicate when they fail, and acknowledging the difficulty or obstacles is going to help to destigmatize that failure, get that communication, and ultimately allow us to move forward in a better, more effective way. There are a ton of ways that you can encourage a climate of psychological safety. I put a few more on the screen, but I know there are a lot of very smart people in our audience together today. So I'd actually like to ask you all, what are other ways that you have seen folks encourage a climate of psychological safety, or how have you done it in the past? I'd like to get a sense for some of the examples that you've either seen or used in your own world. You might also think of this chat in question to say, when have I felt psychologically safe, and what was the other person doing or my teammates doing to make me feel psychologically safe in that moment itself, whether this is in a learning experience or in a team? Thank you, Robert. First answer, actively listening, absolutely. Having folks feel fully heard and that you are paying attention to them is a great answer. Showing vulnerability as a facilitator, absolutely. I mentioned that for leadership, but it exists for learning experiences as well. Responding to input, absolutely true. So when somebody shares, not just saying, okay, and moving forward, but really recognizing that input. When somebody calls out, this is a safe place, or it's okay to fail, or this is how we learn, absolutely. Talking about my failure or my journey through mistakes, I think, is a great way to encourage a climate of psychological safety. Being curious, I love curiosity as a word. I think it is a great mindset to have when we think about psychological safety. I love, Carlton, de-escalate by adjusting tones. One of the things that I talk about with psychological safety sometimes is being anti-judgmental, and how you de-escalate by adjusting tone is a really good tactic to use in that space. Talking slower for uptake, absolutely. And I think this falls into setting people up for success. It can be group norms, but really giving folks the opportunity to be successful by reducing that ambiguity. And Rose, I don't know what you mean by now and then boards, but I want to. I love to hear what other people are doing in this space as we think about how are we encouraging a climate of psychological safety. Offering to help with different context or different materials, making something fit the person itself. As the one note that I have on the screen is recognizing humanity. We are all human, we are all different. I think that's really great. Don't tell us one thing and then expect the opposite. Model the behavior you want to see, absolutely. Feel free to keep adding those in, but I'll go ahead and put a quick moment of conclusion. My hope in takeaways here is that you recognize it may not be easy to create or encourage a climate of psychological safety, but that it's worth it, that one person can make a positive difference, and there are tangible actions you can take. So as we come to the end of my conversation, I want to share a final thought, a thank you moment, and a request. My final thought is a reminder that we want it to be safe to be seen trying. Earlier in my roadmap, I said that I would love for you to do something differently coming out of this conversation. And so that's my last ask of you all. What is it that you will do differently coming out of our conversation today? Whether that's something that you got from the chat or from the content or the context, I'd love to know in the chat, what is it that you will do differently because you joined our conversation today? Briefly, I saw in the chat a few requests for links, so that's all here if you want to take a quick screenshot, or it'll be available, Emily, for folks to share afterwards. But I'll come back to my chat in request. Final ask of me, or from me, what will you do differently coming out of this session?
Thank you, Kelly. We do have some people coming in here.
Yeah. Power dynamics, the 15% statistics to give folks some safety on it. We need to fail or be willing to fail. reducing unnecessary risk. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much. This is incredible. Kelli, thank you for being here. We do have some time here. If anyone has any outstanding questions, feel free to pop them in the chat as well. But just seeing the amount of people with next steps makes my heart happy. So I gotta say, that's fantastic. I think my biggest, what I'll do differently is to continue to model that behavior. Sometimes it can be hard to admit our own mistakes. And I think it makes a big difference when we do. So, Kelli, thank you for the reminder on that as well.
Absolutely. I think every time I present this, it is another fresh reminder for myself, right? Like I hear these, I say these, I think they're really valuable, but it is a constant encouragement to be open to something that frankly is fairly uncomfortable for most of us.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fair point. Maybe I'll just like set this as my screensaver on my computer so that I
Put it on
can
your board in the
continue.
background.
Yes, yeah, that'll be the whiteboard for the next week. So I just wanted to once again thank you all so much for being here. We will send out the recording of this webinar, so you will have it so that you can kind of rewatch it, and we'll also share some resources. I will once again pop in the chat the two books that we have links of actually that Kelli referenced, which Kelli, well done. I didn't even plan that, so love it. Love when there's a moment of, crossover there, as well as the references to the Charles, I can't say his last name to save my life. Is it Duhigg?
Yes, or at least that's how I've been pronouncing it. I hope that's
Okay.
correct. If
Yeah.
anybody believes that's not correct, put it in the chat because I do like to pronounce people's names correctly, but I
Yeah.
believe it's Charles Duhigg.
Correct us if we're wrong. So we'll share all those resources as well. And yeah, Kelli, thank you again. And I hope everyone has an absolutely lovely day. Bye.
Thank you.